Okay, it must be recording because I see the timer going, but Tim's having trouble. So if about pasture management, go ahead and send me some questions. I had a conversation last night with Elton Mao about his dry pastures and my dry pastures. Tim, send me a signal or something if everybody can hear me. Right, so I guess I'll carry on until I hear from Tim. But we had a nice conversation. We're both experiencing very dry weather right now. My grass in my lawn is all brown. We haven't mowed it for at least 10 days. Okay, I can see your message. So if you got questions, send them this way. We were talking about things that we might do different because it's getting dry and our pastures might become short. We're both rotational grazers. I try to move mine every 3 to 5 days. Try to give them big enough lots that for 3 days, they've eaten about half of it. And that's management we should be doing whether it's dry or not. And so Tim says he's not able to have any things right now. So I guess I'll carry on until he tells me to stop. Good pasture management is to rotate every few days anyway. So we should be doing that anyhow. But with dry weather, it becomes more important that we don't overgraze our lots when we are grazing. Because if we overgraze, it's that much more difficult for it to recover when we do get rain. So be very careful to eat between a third and a half of it and then move your sheep on or goats or whatever you're grazing. Very important that we don't overgraze in dry weather. Now, if you're worried that you're going to run out at some point, keep moving through what you have until you get around to it the next time. And if it's been 20 or 30 days since you were there, I would say go through it again. If you left half behind, it's probably regrown some because that allows it to have more root reserve and it can probably do some growth during dry times. So I would go ahead and work your way through it again, but still only take about half of what's there when you're there and keep moving. If it's looking like it's going to become an extended period of dry weather, I like to supplement while they're out on the pasture, and especially if you're going to hit the second time around and we're still dry. I like to feed soy hulls, and Elton does that too. Now we do them. I like to take and walk along my fence and pour the soy hulls just over the fence so that they can nibble on the soy hulls, and I don't have to walk in among them while I'm feeding it. And Elton likes to go in with his four-wheeler, and then he pours little piles while he's driving. And he doesn't have to fight with them because he's on his four-wheeler. But I don't like having piles of soy hulls. Yes, you can. The question is, can you supplement with hay, or does that create a mess? Well, if the hay is more palatable than the pasture, they will eat up all the hay. And all they'll leave behind is maybe the stems. And as long as you are keeping your hay well spread out, you won't have piles that the stand can't grow through. So, I mean, it's important that you be careful not to get it real thick so that they can eat it down to where back through it. And if you have a good supply of hay, you might want to save that if the pastures totally quit on you. Because if the pastures totally quit on you, then you're probably better off going to a dry lot or a small area and just feeding them hay in a feeder so that you can be more efficient with your hay. That's not ideal, but it is, to me, that's like the last emergency measure you do. You feed your hay without them being on a pasture. And I wouldn't go to that point unless we have eaten our pastures down to where they're maybe 3-4 inches tall. You don't want to take them clear to the ground if you can help it. If we're at that point, there's been no rain and there's no regrowth, then the thing to do is to go to a dry lot and feed them in the dry lot so they don't damage your pastures anymore. Because as soon as we get a rain, if you have a little bit of residual out there, they'll grow better than if you let them eat it clear to the ground. And you'll get to recovery so much quicker by doing that. And another thing that you can do is if you've got a thin pasture or a pasture that's not producing very well, there are some dry weather crops that you could plant into those pastures. I like to plant sorghum Sudan grass into them. And I was custom drilling some Sudan grass for a dairyman one time. And he goes, those pastures aren't very good. It's getting dry. They're not going to produce anything. Just go out there and drill that sorghum Sudan grass in as deep as you can. And I have a no-till drill, so it was able to penetrate in. Didn't put the seed in any moisture, I didn't think. But it did come up in a few days, and sorghum Sudan grass is excellent in dry weather. It can grow on almost no water, and it'll produce a very nice grazable crop in about 30 to 40 days. Get a little over knee high, you can start grazing that. And then if you do have a nice stand of Sudan grass, you need to get on top of grazing it, because when it starts to get head high and shooting heads, then it starts to lose palatability. So it's better if you can graze that sorghum Sudan grass as soon as you can, as soon as it gets to that 2 foot tall mark, because if you graze before that, you run the risk of nitrate poisoning. But, get a little height on it, start grazing it, and it'll grow really well, and it'll provide a tremendous amount of feed in dry weather. It's a great dry weather crop. Another thing that we have planted in the past, what is my experience with teff grass? Well, I have planted teff grass before, and I've seen other people plant teff grass. Teff grass is a really good fill-in grass. It's not something that I would plant as a plan. When you get dry weather, you can plant teff, but it's hard to get started in dry weather. It would need a rain to get going. But if you can get teff going, teff will fill in the holes and provide a very palatable feed for your livestock. And the time I tried teff, it was too dry to get it to grow. But then the next year, a friend of mine down by Danforth that has cattle, he had planted teff, and it was fantastic. And so I guess teff has been a boom or a bust when we use it. It works really good if you get a little bit of rain on it, and then it can be dry and it will grow. But it does need a little bit of rain to get going. Another crop that I like to use is turnips. I can remember one year I planted turnips after I had harvested rye. We had grazed the ewes on the rye in the spring, and when we took them off, when they were done having lambs, it made heads. I combined it, and then I planted turnips in it, and it was dry. The rye crop had really dried the ground out, and then it was dry besides. But the turnips that I planted, I don't know how they did it, but they found moisture and they grew. And that ended up being a fantastic crop on that patch of ground. It wasn't a big acreage area. It was just 3 or 4 acres, but it made great fall grazing for lambs. Some other management things that we can do if we're getting into dry weather is we can reduce what we need to graze. So another thing we have done is you get really, really dry. If you've got young stock nursing on adults and you're close to weaning time, you might want to go ahead and wean those lambs and bring them in and feed them. Because if you're going to feed anything, feed those lambs or young goats, because they're the high value part of the operation. And they would have they would get more benefit out of being fed. And they are really, really good converters of feed because they're in that growth stage yet. Whereas the old moms, the old ladies, your ewes or your does, they don't need as much nutrition if you've weaned them. They can get by for a whole lot less. You could keep rotating them on your dry pastures, and they would survive quite well without it being very nutritious. Or if your pastures have gone completely dormant and there's nothing much there for them, go to the dry lot. You don't need to feed them very much hay, and they can survive an awful long time during dry weather with lower quality feed because they're not in a production phase. Well, hello, Elton. Glad to see you made it on. I'm running through all my ideas because Tim's not here to help buffer my time, and I'm speeding through everything. But I have heard about grass tetany, but have never. What is the deal with this, and is it something I need to be concerned about? Grass tetany happens more in lush conditions than it does in dry conditions. And basically, grass tetany is the grass is growing fast, and it's short of I think it's manganese, but don't quote me on that. And so they create an imbalance because what they're eating doesn't have enough in it. And then what'll happen is they'll act like they're an old workhorse. They'll clump have a strange gait. They'll get thin, and eventually they get disoriented. Okay, why do I choose to rotate every 3 days instead of 4 days or 2 days? Well, if your pastures are growing right and your livestock comes in and they chew off the best parts, as soon as it chews off part of that plant, it starts to regrow. And so it's on the 3rd day when it starts to regrow. And you would like for them to be gone so that the regrowth doesn't get grazed down, so that it can grow back better. If you could wait 4 days, but that all depends on the stage your plants are in. You could go the 4 days and they might not be regrowing yet because of the stage they were in, and you could get away with that. But 2 days is all right, but 2 days is a lot more work than 3 or 4. And that's that much more time you're spending making fence. Worm eggs that are deposited usually don't hatch from your grazing until the 3rd or 4th day, or later if it's dry. So that's another reason that the 3rd day is kind of like a magical thing to shoot for. But if they've already eaten down their half, then it's time to move. Don't wait that extra day and let them get hungry, because they'll destroy your pasture. And then when you do move them into the lusher field, they might gorge themselves. And that's when you get things like bloat and other problems happening. So, but grass tetany is more of a lush spring thing. And dry weather, we have to be more concerned about poisoning. We can get nitrate poisoning in dry weather conditions if let's say you had Sudan grass that was cut off and then it regrew. Those first few sprigs are very high in nitrates and can create a nitrate poisoning situation. That's why I prefer to use pearl millet over Sudan grass, but because it doesn't carry that problem quite as bad. And you also can't get prussic acid with pearl millet like you can with Sudan grass. So a lot of the show folks in our area try to breed in midsummer to get early fall lambs and kids. Does heat play a role in breeding and viability? Very much so. We are planning breedings now. We're going to have an AI the end of July. There's an awful lot of AIs that go on starting the 1st of July because, just like you said, people want those lambs that are born in December and January. Those are their best show animals. So heat does play a factor in success of AI or any matings, especially if we have a lot of heat and we put the males in heat stress. If we put the rams or billies in heat stress, we run the risk of making them infertile. And there's a lot of high quality sheep that just plain aren't fertile in June and July because of the heat. And seasonally, we aren't really shortening the days yet, so they aren't seasonally preparing for breeding season yet. They won't do that for another month or two. So right now, their testicles are probably at the smallest size of the year. Libido is at its lowest right now, and it's probably the most difficult time to expect rams to settle ewes. Now, if you're AIing, you get around that because you can use frozen semen. And that can be done at a time when rams have a better chance to be fertile. And so that way, even if you can cycle your ewes, you can use the frozen semen of the rams, and that will help with conception rates. If you're wanting to breed live for that time of year, I know goats aren't quite as light sensitive as sheep, but a lot of sheep are light sensitive, and we would need to force them to come into heat. We do that by using cedars and PG 600. We have rather good luck doing that. I just got done with 2 groups of ewes for fall lambs, where I use the ram to breed the ewes, and I use cedars and PG 600 to bring them into heat. The first group of 11 of 11 bred to the ram. Now, he was fertile, but we aren't far enough along yet to find out how many of them settled. When they get to be 30 days along, we'll send blood in, and we'll determine if they're pregnant or not. The second group I did 2 weeks later. I did a group of 12, and 11 of those 12 all bred to the ram. And the way I was only using 1 ram, so I would pull 3 cedars a day and give them a shot of 2 cc's of PG 600, and that's on the short side. But when you're naturally breeding like that, you don't need quite as much PG 600 to get the ewes to come into heat, because that's really the goal there with the cedar and the PG 600 is to get them into heat. If we were doing AI, we would maybe want to use a little more PG 600. We want to be a little more timely with when we gave it, so that we could make certain that they were in the proper sequence for when it was time to do the AI. And that's all a timing thing, mostly. Are there any concerns about having lambs or kids in hot weather? Having lambs and kids born in hot weather like this time of year, I know Elton is most of the way through his lambing. But when I used to lamb in the late spring, early summer, the biggest problem that I ran into was fly strike. And those lambs would be born, they're all wet. Flies would, flies are starting to populate right now, and they would come down and they would just coat a lamb. And a white lamb would look black because it has so many flies on it. So we got to where we were spraying with fly spray a lot. Especially like when we would ban those lambs, because we would ban the tails right away as soon as we could catch them and give them an ear tag. I would actually take my rubber bands and I would coat them in fly spray before I would put them on the lamb. And that would kind of keep those flies from laying eggs on that part of the tail. And it would give it a chance to dry out and fall off before it got many flies in it. I have a question from Cheryl. After you rotate on the 3rd day, how long do you wait to put them back on the same pasture? It would be ideal if you could wait at least 30 days. Longer rotations are even better. But 30 days is what you want to shoot for. that gives all the plants an opportunity to regrow. When we get in dry weather, that 30-day period may not be long enough for good regrowth. But if you are at a point where you're running out of options on grazing and you got to go back, sometimes you can go back 20, 25 days if it's growing good. But ideally, if you could wait 30, it'd be best. But in dry weather, sometimes we got to modify and change what we're doing. We have a question. How are the Australian whites? Any lambs out of him yet? Yes, I got 8 lambs this year. We bred maiden ewe lambs to him, and those were born the first 2 weeks of May. They're growing quite nicely. They're very slick haired. It looks like they're going to be good shedders, and they're growing nice. That's all I've got is some 30-day-old lambs, so it's really hard to say, but I do like how they're looking so far. Right now, Sedalia is going on, and the Australian white is having a booth down there for informational purposes. So any of you that get a chance to go down to Sedalia, go visit the booth, talk to Daniel. Daniel's the guy who started the breed here in the United States. Go talk to him, ask him questions about the breed. I think you'll be quite impressed with him and what he has planned for the breed. Next question. I've been lucky so far, no fly strikes yet. Well, that's good, Elton. I think the fact that we're dry is helping. And we get into July and August, we have such a lot higher population of flies by then that anything that's born that time of year is probably more at risk than earlier in the summer. But it still doesn't mean there isn't a chance for a fly population to be so big that they become a problem. So usually if they get dry, then they're all right. What is Sedalia? Sedalia is in Missouri. Sedalia, Missouri is the home of their state fair and is also where the Midwest Stud Ram Sale is. And the Midwest Stud Ram Sale is one of the largest sales in the United States. There'll be a lot of sheep there. Today they were showing a half a dozen breeds. Tomorrow they'll show a bunch more breeds. And then on Friday, they'll have the first set of sheep will have sales. And then on Saturday, the second set of sheep will have sales. So it's a rather large event. They have all different kinds of sheep there. And I think they would have anything that you might want to find. Oh, Elton's saying, look at the leaf tip to know when to regraze that 4-H. So if you have good leaf tips that haven't been chewed at the surface, that'll help you decide that if it's time to regrow or not. Another thing is if you've got clovers and alfalfa, are they blooming or not? If they're blooming, they're much safer to graze than if they're totally vegetative. No blooms, no buds. That's when they're at their highest protein. They're also the most risk of bloat when they're at that stage. If it's grass, if they're shooting seed heads, it'd probably be good to go start grazing that. After you graze it, if there's still seed heads out there, the thing to do is to clip just the heads down so that they regrow better. Next question. Do sheep actually eat the turnips or do they just eat the tops? Does this damage the ground? Depending upon the type of turnip you grow, there are turnips that are all leaf tissue and hardly any bulb. And then the kind I like to grow are the purple top white globe turnips, and they make a really big bulb. And yes, they will eat those turnips, and it's an acquired taste for the sheep. At first, they'll eat the leaves, but not the bulbs. And then after they get a taste for the bulb, they'll start eating the bulb, and they'll eat it all the way down into the ground. And actually, turnips are good for the ground because they're almost like a tillage. So they do sell what's called a tillage radish, where it's very similar in what the turnip does, but that radish goes down in the ground deeper, and it creates holes and channels in the soil. and they've been used to help improve the tilth of the soil. Now the sheep will eat them. They don't like them as well as the turnips, but they will eat them. But those go in the ground so deep that the sheep can't really eat all that. But turnips, I love turnips for feed stuff. Um, and I used to go up to Janet McNally's when I was buying the white-faced ewes to run on my farm. And if you go up there in the fall, she would have pastures that she planted to nothing but turnips. And then she would finish her lamb crop on those turnips. And she would just fence off a small lot of turnips each day and let the lambs eat on it. And they would eat that down to the ground. They just love those things. And then they get fat on them. Matter of fact, they almost look like they were pooping like pigs because they had soft and pale manure, just like a pig would. And that's when you know they're eating good and they're growing good too. And they're excellent for finishing lambs out on the pasture. I have been told only lambs and kids get tapeworms. Is this true? Adult sheep develop resistance? Yes, adult sheep develop resistance. Doesn't mean they don't have the tapeworm. And I was a big follower of Dr. Kennedy when he was alive, and he recommended not worming for tapeworms. He said because the tapeworms are not an economical loss worm. So little lambs will get tapeworms, and you'll see them crapping out worm segments. Now, Dr. Kennedy is right. They're not an economic loss worm. But if you have multiple stresses, let's say we're going through dry weather like we are now, the feed in the pen's not real good, and you've got a young lamb that's got a tapeworm. Well, he's going to get thin before he develops resistance. So 90% of the time, I would say you don't need to worm for tapeworms. But there'll be those moments where productivity is reduced because of the tapeworms, especially if there's other stressors, and then it might be the time that you need to do something about the tapeworms. So that's more of a producer call, depending upon the conditions that you see at the time. And adults do develop resistance to the tapeworms, and so it isn't that they can't harbor them and shed eggs, but they will not affect their productivity because it is one of the easier worms to control too. And the only problem is it is the worm that you can see in the manure. So if you see white segments in the manure, it is tapeworms. It isn't anything else. So, and it's always disturbing when you see a pile of manure and it's half tapeworms. It does make you wonder if you should be doing something about it. Now, if you got a lot of little lambs and you don't have good feed conditions, that might be the time that you want to worm the lambs. But I would not worm old ewes just for tapeworms. Do sheep need shade on pasture? Is this required? All right, so Elton and I disagree on this. Elton provides shade on all his pastures, and I do not. So I have all my ewes are out on pasture right now, and they have no shade. They have, it's not been terribly hot, although there's a lot of sun. It's not been overly hot, so we haven't had any distress because of heat. There are times where, especially white-faced sheep, can get too much sun, and they get what's called a fat head because they have a reaction to the sun. Their head swells up. So if you can provide some shade on the worst of the days, that is good. But I have grazed a long time without providing shade, and it does not harm the animals at all. And production is still good. The only thing is you don't want to be going out there and riling them up and getting them hotter because you have worked them. If you're going to work them, then you got to be able to provide perhaps some shade or a place to rest or extra access to water if you're going to be jostling them up. Another question. I have been told shearing sheep helps them to grow better. Do you agree with this? Yes, especially lambs. So all the big feedlots out west, come the 1st of June, they shear all their lambs on the feedlot. Doesn't matter what size they are. And my sheep shearer, who has retired here recently, would every spring say, "Do you want lambs sheared?" And I go, "Yes." He goes, "Okay, if I'm not farming the last 2 weeks of May, I'll come shear your lambs." And we'd have this discussion. I'd plop a 130-pound lamb in front of him, and he goes, "Well, that isn't the one you want to share. You need to sell him." And then he'd say, "Grab me that 30-pound lamb over there. That's the one that needs shearing because it's the one that's got to grow in the heat." So we would always see lambs do better in the heat if they'd been sheared. Elton says his shade hay racks get moved with the flock every 2 days to new clean grass. And his hay racks are good for providing shade. And just that in some rainy weather, I also think they become accumulation points for sheep. And then I think it creates other problems when it's rainy. I think for sunshades, I think they're great. Matter of fact, I want to build what would just be a sunshade for out in the pasture. Use like a shade cloth up over a metal frame so that they could get out of the sun. If you worm lambs, does that make them less resistant to parasites? That's a good question. It would delay their ability to produce resistance, but their resistance ability comes with time or genetics. And if just because you worm them, it's not going to change their genetic resistance to worms. The time factor, it will change the time factor to develop an age resistance. But if you got animals that are at risk for big production losses, worming is the thing to do. Because I've seen lambs, you get barber pole worms. It's late in the summer and it's dry out, but grass is still growing, but it's getting close to the ground because you've been overgrazing a little, and lambs start picking up worms. And lambs, which are very, very not resistant to worms, regardless of their genetics, they can get overloaded with worms in a short amount of time. And if you aren't on top of that, you can lose lambs quickly. And I've seen that happen. You get going, and they start to bottle jaw, and they start falling over dead as soon as you go out and stir them up a little, and a couple of them can't even run with the others because they're so anemic. So if you're getting whites in the eyes, and that's FAMACHA training, it probably means that they're full of barber pole worms. And it's very important that you stay on top of that, because if you have a overload of barber pole worms, you can lose animals. Elton says, yes, they are a problem in rainy periods. I assume that you're talking about your hay racks. Thing about rainy periods is it's less convenient to go move them because it's raining, but that's when you need to move them more, because then they stand under them in the wet conditions and they create mud, and that's the problem is the mud they create underneath. So if you could move them in wet periods every day, you'd probably be all right. But because it's harder to move them, that's when it becomes a problem. How do you deal with algae in your waterers? Well, I use a tank out on the pasture, and right now I got to fill that tank twice a day for the ewes that are on it. So that water's staying really fresh, and we're not building any algae. Algae happens when water sits still. So if your water's sitting still, that's when you get algae. I check my ewes twice a day, and so I do run fresh water for them, dump them out, and refill. And that'll cut down on algae a lot. You start getting the buildup of algae, then a little bit of bleach and a brush will clean it up, and then it takes a while for it to rebuild. And I know like Elton uses an automatic waterer, so there's just a small quantity of water available to use, but it keeps refilling. And so that is a little harder to build up algae in, but it too will grow algae. And so it would occasionally need cleaning. Walk me through what you would do if you found a lamb down with bottle jaw. How do you deal with this? Well, by the time you find a lamb that's down with bottle jaw, the outcome is very poor. And then the next question is, what's my go-to wormer for barber pole worms? So if I find a lamb down with barber pole worms, I'm probably going to treat the whole lot of lambs, because if you got one that's down and he's to the point where he can't get up because he's so lethargic, you probably have a bunch more that are. And I would like to probably, check eyes on them, but because they're little lambs, if you got a few that are down and white-eyed, you probably have a lot of them that are on the verge. So my go-to wormer for barber pole worms on lambs, I like to use in a critical condition site. I like to use Prohibit. It's the old levomiosol. It's like a powder that you mix in liquid in water and you give it to them. Now, there's a couple different ways to mix it, a couple different ways to get it, but it's an oral drench. You can do the concentrated form where you only give like 2 cc's for 50 pounds. And that's what I like to do, because then I can use an automatic syringer to do that. On a mature ewe, I'll do Prohibit and Dectomax at the same time. And I use the injectable Dectomax. And because the injectable Dectomax gives you broader spectrum control, the Prohibit only kills the adult worms, and it's the adult worms that are sucking all the blood out of the ewes or the lambs. And the Dectomax will kill the immatures. So you get a little faster, more complete kill of the adults with the Prohibit. You get little more broad spectrum and immature worm kill with the Dectomax. So Dectomax will stay in their system a little while. You got to plan your marketings around that if you're going to use it. If you have a bad problem, I would do both on lambs, but then you're not going to be able to market those lambs for at least 28 days, because I believe that is the restriction on marketing on using Prohibit, on using Dectomax. I believe it's only 7 days on Prohibit, but don't quote me on that. We would have to look at the label. When are you making this decision which replacement females you're going to keep? Do you raise them differently than the adults you already have? Yes, we do raise them differently than our adults. We tend to keep them as a separate production group. They can't compete with the old mature ewes, and that all depends on how you raise them. If you raise them inside and you weaned them and you got them separate, it's easy to keep them separate. If you've got raised them on pasture and your females are with their mothers on pasture, we do absolutely want to separate the buck lambs and wean them off. But I also think it's important to wean those ewe lambs off their mothers too, because that you don't want to be nursing that mother's udder for super long extended periods of time, because that's when you start to get more deformed udders. I can remember going to a flock where they left them nurse their entire life, but those udders got misshapen and extended because of that. So I still think it's important to wean off your replacement ewe lambs, manage them separately, separate set of grass if you can. Because if you leave them with their adult counterparts, those adults, when they might shed eggs, worm eggs that your lambs aren't very resistant to. So it's better to go to a clean pasture with your replacement ewe lambs and manage them separately. And you can keep the worm load lower in them than if you run them with your mature ewes. And that gives you a chance to see how one performs compared to another. It takes away the competition factor. And you might not want to breed them the same time as you do your mature ewes. In my case, when I was on the pasture, I would not breed them as ewe lambs. I would wait the extra year before I would breed them. Part of that was because I didn't feel like they were getting enough nutrition as lambs to be well grown by the time it was time to breed. Now, if they had gotten enough, were more than 80% of their mature weight, then you might go ahead and breed them as ewe lambs. So, but I still like separating them, even though there are people that will run their replacement females with their brood ewes. What happens if an udder gets irritated or wound when the lamb or kid is 3 or 4 weeks old? Should I pull the lamb or kid? Can you start bottle feeding this late? It is nearly impossible to teach a 3 or 4 week old lamb to nurse a bottle. They are so imprinted on mom, and that's all they know. That is the only thing they will nurse. If you have a 3 or 4 week old lamb and mom is, say she's got the lamb's teeth are cutting it, or she got a cut in the teeth from being out in some sharp grass or something, those lambs that are on pasture at 3 to 4 weeks old are probably eating enough grass and can go steal from other moms that they would survive. Now, they might not, they might get thin, they might get set back, but they're going to survive. Because when we're doing a bottle lamb, we wean them at 4 weeks of age anyway. So lambs that have learned to eat can survive without their mother's milk at that 4 week point. If the mother's wounds are bad enough that they're not healing because the lamb keeps re-aggravating it, probably the thing to do is to remove the ewe from the pasture, not the lambs, and then treat the ewe until she heals. And if she's got that kind of damage on her udder, the question needs to be, is she going to be a good ewe for next year or not? Did she get mastitis or any other infection in the udder because of the damage? That's something that you got to think about. And if she did it, if she just got a cut and it heals, she'll be fine to keep as a replacement ewe. How do you dry off a female in full milk? Well, usually got a plan for that. You can't just cut them off because then they get too full. You need to cut back on nutrition for a few days so that they produce less milk. When I'm weaning lambs, I like to separate my lambs from the mothers, like lock them all in a creep area for a few hours at a time. And that way the lambs aren't stimulating the mother quite as much. Oh, you were thinking about if there's an accident, a baby dies, or there's an injury. Well, the best thing to do is to actually just leave them dry on their own. They're going to get real full and be real uncomfortable. But every time you go and milk that out, you're opening up that orifice to let bacteria be introduced. And it's probably better if you let it seal over. Depending upon how full they get, you might want to administer some antibiotics if you think they're getting a little red on their udder. And you might milk them if they're so extremely full that they can't even walk. But most times you're better off letting them dry on their own and not touching the udder. And usually ewes are past their peak milking period when they get to that 5th week. Um, they start out a little slow on their milking. The first few days they don't produce a lot of milk. 3rd or 4th day they start to kick it in, and they start to produce more milk, and they continue to produce more milk up until about that 4th or 5th week, and then it starts to decline. And that's just the natural process for milk production. And you can control how much it declines by how much you let the lamb stimulate the ewes and how much feed you give those ewes. Pull their nutrition back. Some people pull their water. I'm not a fan of that. I like to let them have water. Just pull back their nutrition. Can you tell me about prussic acid? Does this happen with a frost as well? Are there plants known to have this issue? Yeah, prussic acid is more of a frost occurring thing. Prussic acid can happen in corn or sorghum Sudan grasses or any of the sorghum type plants. It can be devastating when you get it. The conditions got to be just right to get it. Frost is one, is the big culprit mostly. And I've never seen it. I've only heard about it. And I've planted, you can get it in from corn or Sudan grass. Those are the most biggest culprits. Well, Tim, I'm surprised you have never made it back. Okay, you got one more question. Do you vaccinate against sore mouth? I do not vaccinate against sore mouth. I have sore mouth in my flock, but if sore mouth isn't spreading around good on its own, I depend on sore mouth just spreading through the lambs to give them all protection. But if it's not spreading around good on its own, I will actually go take scabs off of one that's got sore mouth, put it in a little bit of water, chop it up, and then take a wire brush and just scratch under their armpits with that water from the scab you took off, because that's an active infection, but you're giving it on the armpit, and then sore mouth on the armpit isn't going to hurt them like it does on the lips. Now, it might translate to the lips, but by then they're already starting to build immunity, and it won't be nearly as bad on the lips if you do it, scratch them there. Tim says, my computer is dead. Thank you, Rick. I am just here watching with everyone else. Big thanks to you for your help. You saved my butt today. Well, I appreciate that, Tim. I enjoy doing this. It is a little more difficult without having you here to ask questions, but as soon as you started asking questions in the chat box, it got a whole lot easier. So if anybody else has any more questions, I'll be glad to answer them. What can you tell me about ringworm before I go? Well, ringworm is more of a show problem. If you show animals, you're more subject to getting ringworm. It is a fungus on the skin of the lamb, and it spreads easier if when you wash your lambs and you shear them short. That's where it spreads, because they don't have lanolin or the wool to help protect their skin. So a lot of times if we're showing a lot, what we'll like to do is to take udder balm, which is lanolin, and a little warm water, and then just coat them with that. There are some people decide to spray on their lambs when they get done showing so that they don't get ringworm. Ringworm can be very difficult to work with once you get it. Once it's in your barn, you also, it's sort of like sore mouth. It's kind of there. It's hard to manage because it'll sink into wood areas and it'll come back out at the least opportune time. So anyway, I've only ever had ringworm once. Best approach is prevention. And I like to use lanolin on the lambs after we've shown, And if you got access to a good fungicide, that works too. So I lied. One last question, Tim says. What is the deal with leg shag? Is this just a fad? And what was growing the leg hair out supposed to do for the look of the lamb? Okay, well, yes, it is a fad. And leg wool, the last time I checked, I don't know any of us that eats that. So it is a fad to make the lambs look like they have more bone. And because everybody wants more bone in their animals right now. But if you're a true meats person, bigger, heavier, denser bone is actually a detriment to the retail cuts scenario. In other words, you got more weight in bone and you have less weight in muscle. So the shag thing, it's just a fad. The more shag we can grow, the more they think they can get money, the more higher they think they can place. It's just like everything we do. We all think it gives us an edge. Where in reality, it's not really important. So sorry to all the show jocks out there. I just said what you're doing with leg wool is not important, but I know it gives you all feel like it gives you an edge. In the shows I judge, I just sort of snicker when I see one that's 6 inches wide at the base, and they expect me to think that it's better just because it's got all that wool, and it doesn't really matter to me. So I hope that answers your question without making too many people unhappy. All right. Thank you, Tim. I appreciate you doing this for us too. What are some good crops to plant my rotational pastures? Okay, so if you want a permanent, depends on where you are, but around here in the Midwest, I like orchard grass. Timothy is not a good grass to use because it's all spring flush, and same with bluegrass. It's mostly spring flush grass. You don't have much in the dry weather. Orchard grass is pretty drought tolerant. There's a lot of good fescues. And you got to be careful which fescues you get, though. You want to be careful because the ones that have all the endophyte in it, that can change palatability. West Central Missouri, yeah, you'd plant similar grasses to what we do. You might be able to plant some more drought tolerant grasses than what we would, because you probably have experienced more drought than we do. There was a Bermuda grass that we experimented with here, but we froze too much for it to work good. But those would take drought very well, and they might adapt to where you are. Depends on how far north or south you are. But orchard grass is a good dry weather grass, and they have newer ones that aren't as clumping as the old ones. If you don't wait long enough before you graze a pasture, will they rip it out? You mean like a new seeding, I assume. Do I need to let a new pasture rest before grazing? Yes, you got to have enough growth that the roots are well anchored. Grasses and alfalfas that are anywhere from 60 to 75 days of age and have had good growth are probably there. But you still want to graze them light because you don't want them damaging the crown. So you want them to graze off just the top couple inches and then move on. And then just go out there and grab the plants and pull. If they come up, you know it's too soon. That's a good way to check. Last call for questions. Any last thoughts from me? I don't know. Dry weather is challenging. We've gone through it before. You got to think about it ahead of time. So if you've got some coal ewes that are not carrying their load, time to be getting rid of them before everybody else thinks about getting rid of them. Because I know, was it last year, there was drought in Texas, and Lambs hit the market like crazy in Texas, and that killed the market. So get rid of your dead weight before everybody else thinks about it. If you're really getting short, get your young stock off of your old stock and maybe pen them up. Use your thumb and pointer finger to simulate a sheep eating the grass, and then pull on it. And if it pulls the roots up, that means that it's not in the ground enough yet. But usually by the time a new stand is around that 75-day mark, you should be getting to the point where it's good enough that it'll hold itself in the ground. And it's probably grown enough that you might want to do a real fast and light grazing. So I prefer to mow mine for hay. All right, Tim's saying thank you. He'll call me when the stream is over. I appreciate your time tonight. Sounds like we're wrapping it up. So until next time, thanks from my end.